hello. A furiously awesome hello to you today on this very gloomy day here in Norwich, in England, in Britain, in the United Kingdom. I think it's in that order. It's nice to be here. Nice to be back. We are reading The Fury. And so far in The Fury, Benny Milston has died a horrible death because he had a headache, and then one day his headaches just stopped, and his mum and his sister just attacked him, and some neighbours threw themselves through the window and tore him to pieces. And we've met Brick and Daisy and Cal, who are generally three normal kids going to school. They've got friends. Brick's got a girlfriend, but they've all had a bit of a headache. People have been looking at them a little bit weirdly. People haven't been as kind as they normally are, and they can't really figure out why. Everyone seems to be acting differently around them. We've also just met in the last chapter, which is a special chapter called The Other, a London policeman who was called to the morgue to see a corpse, and his corpse has been opened up, completely dead, but air is being drawn in through this unending breath, and they can't figure out where this air is going because it's not going into their lungs. Their lungs aren't there anymore. They've taken them out. But the air is going somewhere, and nobody knows what is going on. So that is like another thing that is happening in this strange book of mine. So we'll read another few chapters. We're on to Friday now. And the little quote I picked for this is, "Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned." That's W.B. Yeats' The Second Coming, one of my favourite poems. Brick, as you may remember, was snogging his girlfriend in the basement of Fursville, this abandoned amusement park, and she suddenly turned on him and bit him and basically tried to kill him, and he managed to lock her in the basement, and she went completely crazy, and she's still down there. Brick sat at the top of the basement steps, his head in his hands, flinching every time he thought he heard a noise from below. He felt empty, completely and utterly drained. It had taken all his strength just to make it up the stairs. Shortly after getting out of the basement, he'd found a steel rod in the pavilion. It looked like one of the electrical poles from a dodgem, and he'd managed to wedge it tight between the door and the wall. He'd packed everything he could find around it to lock it in place, praying that it would hold up against the onslaught from the other side. It had, so far. Lisa had spent the best part of 3 hours battering on the door, each attempt growing weaker and feebler, until the sound of her body hitting the wood and metal was no louder than a gentle slap. It was the noises in between, the crunches, that had turned his stomach, though, that had made him think he was going to go insane sitting there in the darkness. Brittle snaps, something wet that accompanied her steps, shuffling flaps that he imagined were her falling and trying to get up again, some of which went on for 10-15 minutes at a time. And worst of all were the groans and snarls, noises that could have come from a wounded animal in a trap, if it wasn't for the half-words buried in the mess. The only one he could recognise was his name, spat out again and again in panting, wretched screams until he had to clamp his hands over his ears and blot them out with cries of his own. At 10:53 the attack on the door had stopped. Brick had pressed his ear against it, hearing jagged, even breathing. Lisa was asleep or unconscious. That's when he'd made his way up the stairs. He knew that was the exact time because he'd had his crappy Nokia on his lap ever since. 999 thumbed into it, but the call button unpressed. He'd been on the verge of ringing for an ambulance about 100 times, but something had stopped him. The thought of what the paramedics would say when they got here, them and the cops. They'd see a girl beaten half to death, a broken nose, a snapped ankle, and God only knew what else. A girl who'd almost killed herself trying to break out of a locked basement in an abandoned theme park. And when Brick showed them his single injury, the teeth marks in his eyebrow, they'd just say she'd done it in self-defence. And of course Brick had one of those faces. Everybody hated him. But that alone hadn't stopped him calling for help. After all, if the police arrived and Lisa was still going mental, then they'd know for sure that this wasn't his fault. No, it was a voice in his head, a good voice for once, saying, "She's going to be fine. She just went a bit crazy, that's all. Give her a few hours and she'll be better." Over and over. Too convincing to ignore. The voice had to be right. Give her some time and she'd be okay. Something else in his head started to argue, but he drowned it out, pushing deeper into his hands. His eyebrow was burning. He'd actually had to pick Lisa's missing tooth out of his flesh, the incisor still gripped in his palm, and he could barely open his swollen right eye. He looked down into the pool of liquid darkness that sat at the bottom of the steps. There was a fine silver gauze hanging from the skylights, but it didn't have the guts to go anywhere near the basement. He could just about make out the crack of candlelight under the door, unbroken ever since Lisa had stopped moving. He'd thought about going back down, seeing if she was okay, but his body had mutinied, refusing to obey a single command from his brain. What was his plan? He didn't know. He just wanted to curl up and sleep, to wake the next morning in his own bed with a text from Lisa saying, "Soz, won't happen again." But he was too wired to sleep, his body aching all over from the fight. The adrenaline now a spiked ball in his stomach and lead weights in his arms. There was a soft noise from below. Brick cocked his head and his heart once again in overdrive. At first he thought he'd imagined it, but sure enough there was another sliding sound, then a scrape that could have been fingernails on wood. She was awake. Brick didn't move, afraid that if he so much as breathed too loudly it might set her off again. The stripe of golden light split into two, then into four, then disappeared altogether as Lisa pressed herself against the door. He could hear breathing now, wheezed, desperate. There was a rattle as she tried the handle, the metal pole holding. "Brick!" Her voice was an old woman's, his name misshapen, the B barely there and the R now a W. It was spoken not with malice but with fear. Help me." His stomach dropped into his feet, his heart following. He stood, swaying. "Help me." "Lisa," he said, his own voice high and broken. The shuffling noises grew louder. He could hear her scraping the door. Let me go, Brick," she said. "Please, I'm hurt. I just want to go home. Let me go. I'll do anything. Please." Brick ran a hand through his hair, feeling the tears coming again, echoing Lisa's which rose from the basement. He took a step down, gripping the railing like he was descending Everest. "Please, Brick," Lisa cried. "I'm scared. Why are you doing this?" I'm not doing it," he croaked, taking another step. "You attacked me. You bit me." "I didn't," came her reply, choked almost beyond recognition. "I didn't do anything. Just let me go, Brick. I won't tell anyone, I promise." Tell anyone what, he thought. What did she think had happened? What if she didn't remember? What if she honestly believed he'd attacked her? He realised he was halfway to the next step, his leg hovering. He pulled it back. "Brick!" she screamed, rattling the handle harder now. "I'm bleeding!" That did it, breaking through his need for self-preservation. What if she was bleeding badly? What if she was dying? So what if he got arrested? Questioned. He hadn't attacked her. They'd do a lie detector test or something and find that out. It was Lisa. He couldn't just stand here and let her bleed to death in the basement of Fursville's derelict pavilion. "Okay, I'm coming. Just hang on," he said as he walked unsteadily down the steps. He dropped into the darkness, careful not to trip. Lisa's sobs grew louder as he neared, the scrape of her nails on the door setting his teeth on edge. "Hurry," she said. "Bleeding. Help." He reached the corridor below, crouching down to try and locate the metal brace. From behind the door, Lisa's words were getting weaker, and he imagined her lying in a pool of blood, trying and failing to get up on her broken leg. There was a grunt, a desperate breath. "Brick, let me oh." "Hang on," he said, grabbing hold of the bar with both hands. "I'll be there in a minute." Her words were now meaningless clumps of sound, pinned between pig-like snorts. Brick paused, angling his head again. That short delay probably saved his life. Lisa threw herself at the door, so hard that the top corner pinged open a crack despite the bar. She screamed, then again, pounding relentlessly, driving Brick up the stairs on all fours. This time he didn't stop at the top. He ran blind down the pavilion corridor, her banshee-like shrieks giving chase. Cal. Oakminster, 7:02 a.m. Cal was woken by his phone, the machine gun sound effect calling him up from a dream about Georgia and prison cells. It spun apart before he could catch hold of it, dissolving into the warm morning light. He reached out groggily, fishing on his bedside table until he found it. The text was from Megan. "What happened to you yesterday?" It took him a second to remember yesterday, and when he did, he sat up in bed, frowning. They'd left him. All of them. Run off and deserted him at the library. He'd ended up walking home, even though it took about 45 minutes rather than 10 on the bus, getting more and more annoyed with them the later it got. By the time he'd stormed in the front door, ignoring his mum and going straight to his room, he'd been properly pissed off. He yawned, then wiped the sleep from his eyes, blinking the phone back into focus. "You all left me," he started writing. Then after a moment's consideration, he wiped the screen clear and replaced it with, "Got bored, went home." He wouldn't let them have the satisfaction of knowing they'd got to him. He dropped the phone onto the table, folding himself back under the duvet. He couldn't be arsed with the thought of school today. There was the next interform cup match at lunch, but he knew he'd have to spend it listening to the jeers of his mates. "Poor Callum, did we scare you off? Oh, didn't Mummy make it all okay?" No, better let them sweat it out. Make them think that maybe he decided not to play anymore. Let's see them win 3-1 against 12H without their star midfielder. His mum would let him skive off, no problem. She was a big softie. All he had to do was give her his best puppy dog expression, and she'd give in to him. His dad, the only potential obstacle to his plan, was away on one of his endless business trips to Spain. To be honest, he wasn't actually feeling all that well anyway. His head was weird, like it was stuffed with cotton wool, that faint thump-thump of a headache still breathing against his skull. He rolled over, stretching his legs and looking at the window. The light that seeped in past his curtains was thick and honey-coloured, and he could already feel the heat of the morning pressing in from outside. It was going to be another flawless day. Too good to spend in bed, he decided, headache or no headache. Better to stockpile his sick day points, use them later in the year when it was hammering it down outside and the streets were ice rinks. Besides, he had his weekly kung fu class this evening, and he really didn't want to miss that. He was going for his advanced level Choi Li Foot grading in a few weeks, and he still hadn't mastered everything he needed to. He checked his phone again to make sure Megan hadn't texted back, then clambered out of bed. There was an in-betweeners episode he'd only managed to get halfway through last night, and he flicked it back on, listening to it as he brushed his teeth in the sink in his room. He got changed, then opened the curtains, a shaft of pure sunlight bathing him like he was Bruce Almighty or something, being embraced by the finger of God. Man, he loved summer. Cal headed downstairs, making a brief detour to the bathroom before strolling into the kitchen. "Morning, Mum," he said, yawning again, slumping down on one of the stools around the breakfast bar. His mum stood in the corner by their huge double range, a pan bubbling on the hob. She made him an egg every morning whether he wanted it or not. This morning was a definite not, the milkshakes from last night still somewhere down there playing tag in his intestines. "I said morning, Mother." She didn't reply. Cal left her to her cooking, turning to the paper on the table and idly scanning the TV guide. Behind him the pan rattled and clanked like an old car. The machine gun noise went off again from inside his pocket, and he whipped the phone out. Megan again. "A-hole, we didn't know where you'd gone." What was she playing at? They were the ones who'd left, and if they'd really not known where he'd gone, then why hadn't they texted him while he was walking home? He punched the phone back into his pocket, feeling the hangover from his mood last night start to grow. Something popped from the stove, and the smell of burning filled the kitchen. Cal got up, walking over. "Earth to Mum," he said, "you're burning the house down." The pan on the stove had boiled dry, 2 eggs inside oozing out of their blackening shells, the whole thing shaking so much it looked ready to take off. Cal grabbed the handle and lifted it from the gas, slamming it down onto another hob. "What the hell are you doing, Mum?" he asked, turning to her. She still hadn't moved, her bleach blonde hair concealing her face, and she smelled funny, older somehow. "Oh no, she's had a stroke," was Cal's first heart-stopping thought. Heart-stopping thought. He reached out, pulling her hair back so he could see her face, and the touch made her jump. Not just flinch, she literally jolted so hard her whole body came off the floor, like she'd had an electric shock. "Mum," Cal asked, "what's wrong?" She turned her head slowly, her eyes taking a moment to find him. They were bloodshot and streaked with yellow. They weren't his mum's eyes. Cal took a step back, suddenly cold, his hand sliding along the kitchen counter, knocking a half block of butter to the floor. The sound of it landing seemed to snap her back to attention. She tilted her head, her brow furrowing, her eyes swimming back into focus, once again her own. "Mum?" Cal asked. "Yes," she said. A phantom smile danced over her lips. "Nothing," Cal said, bending down and picking up the butter, but never looking away from her. "Are you okay?" She nodded like a puppet on a string. Then she seemed to remember where she was, picking up the saucepan with the eggs in it and giving it a shake. "Oh, these are no good. Shall I make you another one?" The way Cal's stomach was churning, he didn't think he'd ever eat again. "I'm okay," he said, retreating towards the kitchen door. For some reason he didn't want to turn his back on her. "I'll get her something at school." "Your lunchbox is on the table," she said, opening the metal bin and hammering the upside-down saucepan against it like she was chopping firewood. The noise was deafening. Cal grabbed the Tupperware container, almost tripping over his feet in his hurry to get out of the room. His mum watched him go, beating the pan against the bin in purposeful, even strokes that he could hear long after he'd closed the front door behind him. Brick, Fursville, 8:18 a.m. Things are about to get worse for Brick. Brick woke beneath a blanket of sunshine. It was only when he tried to move, 100 tiny blades worrying into his muscles, that he remembered where he was. He sat up, Fursville shimmering into focus around him, drenched in fresh morning light. He was lying next to the boo-boo station, a stone's throw from his bike, a patch of thick seagrass for a mattress and his t-shirt for a pillow. He leant back against the wood, brushing ants from his face and neck, knowing there was a reason he felt so sore. "Lisa, we had a fight. She tried to kill me. She's still down there." That thought sucked all the warmth from the day, leaving the park as dull and as cold as December. Brick shivered and pulled his t-shirt back on, wrapping his hands around his knees and hugging them tight against his chest. He rocked gently back and forth. He'd made it this far last night, after Lisa had started hammering on the door again, with nowhere else to go and unable to leave her, despite the fact she'd turned into a raging psycho. He'd collapsed on the spot and drifted into an uneasy sleep. His dreams that night had been full of Lisa's screams, and he wondered if they'd been real, if they'd cut up from the basement full of fury, searching for him. He dug his phone from his pocket. There were no missed calls. Lisa's mum and dad must have been absolutely bricking it. Literally bricking it, he thought, with a bitter snort of laughter. He'd promised to get her home by 10 at the latest. They'd be out there looking for him. The police, too, by now. Luckily, they didn't have his number. His phone was a cheap, prepaid one from the garage. And nobody, apart from him and now Lisa, knew about this place. He froze. Lisa had a phone. What if she called the police? That would look even worse. It would make it seem like he really was keeping her prisoner. But wait, no. If she'd been able to use her phone, then she'd have done it by now. The place would be crawling, and Brick would be inside a cell at Norwich Station, cops pounding him with questions. Maybe she was too far gone to remember how to work it. Maybe she'd messed up her hand so badly trying to get out that she couldn't press the buttons. Or maybe she couldn't get a signal down there. That would be it. Not all networks worked this far out of the city. Brick started to rock again, feeling guilty at the relief that soothed his knotted stomach. Great, your girlfriend can't make emergency calls from where you locked her up last night. That calls for a celebration. And he wondered, not for the first time since the previous evening, whether he was the one who'd actually gone nuts. Maybe he'd flipped. His moods had got worse and worse this past year. What if his brain had just reached meltdown and he'd taken out a lifetime's worth of anger and frustration on her? He saw Lisa's face, those eyes boiling out of their sockets as she bit into him, smelling her heavy, blood-soaked breath, hearing that gargled, dying rabbit scream as she turned on him for no reason. No, that memory was real. It would be with him for the rest of his life. So what could he do? Calling for help was no longer an option. It was already too late. If the ambulance got here and she'd already... No. He couldn't bring himself to think it. But if that had happened, then he'd be done for murder. Cold-blooded, first-degree, front-page, crazy guy slaughters girlfriend in creepy abandoned theme park. Murder. Any defence he might have had if he'd called the police straight away. was now long gone. He could just go, leave her here, claim to her parents that he'd dropped her off down the street, that he didn't walk her to the door because he didn't want them to see her on the bike. Yeah, that was good. It seemed plausible. His dad would give him an alibi. Say he came home. His dad was good like that. They might never find her. No! He screamed in his head, the noise spilling up his throat as a low, horrid groan. He couldn't do that. He wasn't like that. He couldn't leave anyone to die alone in a basement, let alone Lisa. The fact that the thought had even crossed his mind made him feel sick, made him feel like a monster. He slapped his forehead twice, 3 times, opening up the wound in his eyebrow, feeling the tears start to swell again. What the hell was he going to do? His dad. Maybe he should just tell his dad everything. He'd probably get a slap for it, but his dad would know what to do. If they went to the police together, then it might not look so bad. His dad was a waste of space, no doubt about it, but at least he was an adult. They'd listen to him. They'd believe him. Brick pushed himself up the wall of the boo-boo station. He'd never felt so weak in all his life, his whole body trembling, hollow. Over the caved-in roof of the ticket gate to his left, he could see the highest peak of the log flume, not quite as tall as the roller coaster or the big wheel, but still pretty impressive. He closed his eyes, the world moving like a spinning top that's almost out of momentum. He could see himself in the plastic canoe, racing downhill, his dad's arms rooting him in place. Gravity. His mind made up, Brick walked to his bike, flicked up the kickstand and climbed onto the saddle. His helmet made his face sting, but it did a good job of covering the wound. It took even longer than usual to get the bike going, 7 or 8 attempts before the engine buzzed to life, and he was out through the fence. He had fought his way through the laurel before he noticed that his petrol gauge was in the red. Ah, damn it. He'd meant to fill up on the way over. 2 people on the back made the bike guzzle fuel. But he decided not to because he couldn't face the thought of stopping long enough for Lisa to start moaning at him again. It was okay. There was a garage about a mile west. He'd fill up and be back in Norwich by 9. His dad would be at work, but Brick knew which site he was on, the same one he'd been on for 18 months, the massive housing development next to the old paper mill. He checked both ways, the coast clear. Then he wobbled left, accelerating down the road and taking the first right towards the fertiliser factory. It felt good to be moving, even though something in him balked at the idea of leaving Lisa behind. The thought of running, of never coming back, ghosted at the back of his head, but it vanished almost as soon as it appeared. He kept a steady 40, not wanting to draw attention to himself, even though he felt as if he had a giant arrow over his head, labelled Girlfriend Killer. But she isn't dead, he kept telling himself. She's going to be okay. He turned off the main road onto the garage forecourt, pulling up at the nearest pump and cutting the engine. There was a $5 and shrapnel in his wallet, and that would get him back to the city. Through the window of the shop, he could make out the cashier. He dealt with him dozens of times before on the way out to Hemingway, a right miserable old git, but the way he was looking at Brick now was different. He felt his cheeks light up and lowered his head. What if he'd been on the news or something? Pictures of him in the local paper? No, surely not. Lisa had only been gone for a night. The man probably just thought he was going to skip as soon as he'd fueled up. He looked again and the cashier had gone. He glanced at the pump. £3.31, £3.37. Maybe he needed to find a hideout that was closer to home, he thought, before realising that he might never be able to go back to Fursville. Strangely, that thought filled him with more grief than anything else. There was a squeal of tyres behind him, and he turned in time to see a small red hatchback There was a squeal of tyres. What's wrong with me today? There was a squeal of tyres behind him, and he turned in time to see a small red hatchback slam into the back of a battered taxi on the road by the garage. The cars rocked together, steaming, then lay still. Oh, at least I'm not the only one having a bad day, he thought. The driver of the taxi was getting out. He looked mega pissed. The woman behind the wheel of the car was opening her door too, her hair a mess, her face white from where her airbag had deployed. From the look of it, they were about to have an almighty slagging match. £4 and a penny, £4 and 9 pennies. A bell rang from the other direction and the garage door opened. The cashier walked through it, probably to make sure everyone was all right, but there was still something wrong with the man's face. It was twisted up into a kind of snarl, his eyes burning. He looks like Lisa. Exactly like her, Brick thought. And another bell began to ring, this one in the centre of his brain, some kind of instinctive alarm. The cashier was coming right at him, walking fast, grunting with each step. "I'm going to pay," said Brick, his voice broken into 1,000 pieces. The cashier didn't seem to care, his pace quickening. There were noises from the other direction too, a ragged shriek. Brick swung around to see the taxi driver coming across the street, breaking into a run, heading for the forecourt. The woman was right behind him, her face so bent by fury that it looked painted on. She was the one who was screaming. Brick ripped out the nozzle, throwing it to the floor. He jumped back onto the bike, fear turning his bones to liquid. He slammed his foot on the starter, the bike wheezing and then falling silent. The cashier had reached the pumps, his old face mottled, his jowls swinging. He was a small man, too fat and too old to ever have scared Brick, but that expression, there was nothing in it but murder. "What?" he said, almost shrieking himself now. He tried again, his foot slipping off the pedal, then again. It was too late. The cashier threw himself at Brick and unleashed a punch. Brick ducked, the bike almost toppling between his legs and bringing him down with it. Only adrenaline kept him upright. The man grabbed hold of his helmet, wrenching his head down. Footsteps behind him, more howls from the woman. Brick lashed out, all of the time feeling like his head was about to be ripped off. The cashier wasn't budging. "No!" The word forced up past the chokehold on his neck. "No!" He let go of the bike, unclipping the helmet and freeing it. The cashier stumbled backwards, hitting the curb around the pump and falling onto his backside, the helmet still grasped in his hands. Brick didn't look back. He just leapt onto the starter pedal again, throwing all his weight down on it. The engine wheezed, popped, then sparked on. He revved, the bike moving impossibly slowly. Something grabbed the back of his t-shirt, pinching his flesh, and he shunted himself forward on the seat. He caught sight of his reflection in the shop window, an ecstasy of terror, wide-eyed and open-mouthed, the taxi driver and the woman bearing down on him. He wrenched the accelerator so hard the rubber grip tore, the bike guttering on the verge of stalling. He swept around between the pumps and the shop, his feet on the ground, propelling the bike forwards, skidding on the oil-slicked tarmac, the woman still clutching his t-shirt. There were more people on the street now, swarming from their cars, all of them glaring, just like Lisa. They're just like Lisa, all of them running towards him, a stampede. He recovered his balance, accelerating out of the garage, the woman's hand ripping loose, taking some fabric with it. He ducked beneath the arms of a man on the pavement, thumping into another woman hard enough to send her sprawling. Someone in a car veered towards him, clipping his rear wheel. But he hung on for his life, weaving left, right, the swelling crowd surging after him like rats after the piper as he fled into the sun. So, not good. Back with Daisy now. Daisy, Boxwood St Mary, 9:38 a.m. I'm still a little bit snotty, but I'm a little bit better. Daisy was late, really late. School had started an hour ago and she was only just now scrambling out of her pyjamas, trying to find a clean polo and socks, while staring in disbelief at the clock by her bed. Why hadn't her parents woken her up? They pulled her kicking and screaming out of bed every morning without fail, which is why she never bothered to set her alarm anymore. She took a ball of socks from her drawer, doing her best to put them on while walking, almost tripping herself up. She stopped, taking a deep breath. What was it her dad always said? Haste makes waste, or something like that. By the time she'd decided that the phrase was meaningless, she'd managed to wrestle both socks on, walking briskly down the landing towards the stairs. She had clattered down the first 4 when she heard something moving in her parents' bedroom. She stopped, cocking her head over her shoulder. In the silence, she became aware that her head was aching, a pulse, not hers, swelling and ebbing in her ears, the same as it had yesterday, but worse now. Thump, thump. Thump, 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 thump. Frowning, Daisy made her way slowly back onto the landing. "Mum," she called out. "Dad?" She walked to the door, only now noticing that it was closed. Her parents never closed their door, even at night. When she was much younger, Daisy had demanded it was always left open, and it had stayed that way ever since, even though she was nearly 13 now and knew things she hadn't back then and would almost prefer it if they kept it shut. She reached out, her knuckles hovering next to the wood, but not making contact. What was she scared of? She knew exactly what she was scared of. She was scared of walking in and seeing her mum puking into the washing up bowl, her hair coming out in clumps, her skin the colour of dishwater. She was scared of having to go through it all again, even though they told her that the chances of it reappearing in her brain were extremely low. She was scared of other things too, worse things, but she trained herself to stop thinking about them because just having those things in your head might make them come true. She swallowed, even though her mouth was as dry as sandpaper. Then she knocked. There was another thump from inside, then a thin, reedy voice. Daisy couldn't make out what it said, so she knocked again, her ear almost touching the wood. That voice again, was it calling her name? Her heart lodged in her throat. Daisy twisted the handle and pushed the door open. Darkness and a dusty, almost sour smell seeped out into the hallway. The curtains had been pulled shut, thick, double-lined velvet ones that her dad had hung so that her mum could sleep when she'd been really ill. It looked like 3 a.m. in there. "Hello?" she said, the room swallowing her voice. "Daisy?" She took a step inside, her eyes needing a moment to adjust. Her parents were 2 lumps beneath the duvet, their upper bodies black smudges on the cushioned headboard. For some reason the sight made her think of gravestones side by side in the cemetery, and she actually heard herself gasp. She saw her dad move, leaning forward and then throwing himself back, making the headboard crunch against the wall. "Dad, what's wrong?" she asked, walking towards the bed, trying not to breathe in. The air was thick with the stench of old people, not like her mum and dad, but old. "Come here," said her mum, her voice like a breeze kicking leaves down the street. Daisy waited for the "we need to talk," but it never came. The only sound was the click of her dad's throat as he breathed. She walked around her mum's side of the bed, her hand on the footboard to steady herself. She wanted to rip the curtains open, the window too, but she didn't dare. She didn't want to find out who was lying in that bed. My parents, obviously, she told herself. Who else could it be? "The wolf," something in her brain said. "It's the wolf, and it's dressed like your mum and dad. Look closely and you'll see it, Daisy. And you'd better, because if you don't, then the wolf will get you." "Oh, shut up," she shouted to her brain. It always played tricks on her when she was scared. As if to prove to it that she was brave, Daisy sat on the edge of the mattress, her hand smoothing the duvet until it found her mum's. She clasped it, holding it tight. "Are you okay?" she asked. Her mother's fingers were damp stalks. They made no effort to tighten around Daisy's. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," said her mum. A little light was trickling in from the hall, tentatively exploring her parents' faces. It hung in their eyes as a bright spark, but it wasn't strong enough to illuminate their expressions. She was pretty sure she could make out her dad's teeth, though, clenched together between pulled back lips. She sat slowly forward, then lurched back again, the thump making the whole bed tremble. For the first time it occurred to her that she might be dreaming. Her mum turned her head until those sparks found Daisy. "Come, lie with us." "Don't," said her brain, but once again she shushed it. She climbed onto the bed, trying to avoid trampling her mum as she wedged herself into the middle. It was the safest place she could ever imagine being, sandwiched between her mum and dad in their room. It was the place she'd weathered 1,000 nightmares. And yet she didn't tuck her legs beneath the duvet. "What's wrong?" she said, looking from her mum to her dad and back. Are you ill again?" Her mum's head slid round, her body completely motionless. In the gloom, the smile she gave Daisy belonged to a china doll. "I'm fine," she said. "I'm as right as rain." "Right as rain," said her dad, making Daisy jump. She looked at him and he stared back. He smiled too, but it slid off his face like water from a raincoat. There was a clack as he snapped his teeth closed. "We just wanted a cuddle," said her mum. "A hug," added her dad. They moved together, their bodies shifting, their arms rising, too long, too spindly in the dark. Her mum looped both hands over her shoulders, pulling her close, nuzzling her lips against Daisy's hair. Her dad's followed, wrapping around them both, his chest against her back. They were breathing perfectly in time, and when they inhaled, Daisy felt her bones creak as the space between them shrank. She tried to shift her arms to return the hug, but there was no room. "We love you, Daisy," said her mum. "Whatever happens, never forget that." Daisy couldn't twist her head around to see her mum. The kisses on her forehead were too fierce. They were battering her like hail, making her headache sing. What do you mean, she asked. What's going to happen? No answer. Her parents tightening their grip, ratcheting her in like a snake with its prey. The smell seemed worse here, and a tickle of fear crept into Daisy's stomach. Once again she could hear that voice in her head. They're not who you think they are. It's the wolf, and it's wearing your parents for pyjamas. It was such a ridiculous, terrifying image that she couldn't decide whether to laugh or scream. What's going to happen? She asked again. I don't want anything to happen. Everything will be okay, said her mum. Her words muffled by Daisy's hair. We love you so much. Nothing will hurt you. We won't hurt you. Hurt her? What was that supposed to mean? She began to squirm, the tickle fast blossoming into full-blown panic. But they weren't letting her go, their grip so tight now that it was twisting her neck. Mum, it hurts. She could see her legs kicking on the bed, pushing the duvet down in rumpled folds. The old people's smell was like something solid over her mouth. Mum! The hug began to loosen, her dad's arms relaxing as he rolled onto his back. Her mum unlocked her wrists, letting Daisy push herself up. She massaged her neck, looking at her parents, only just managing to keep the tears from flowing. Her mum smiled at her, using cool fingers to brush a strand of hair from Daisy's face. Her eyes were dark, but that firefly of light buzzed freely in them. It made her look happy, but far away. She stroked her hand down Daisy's cheek, gently holding her head. Whatever happens, always remember that we do love you. Always remember. We love you so much, Daisy. I love you too, Daisy said. Then she threw herself at her mum, hugging her with the same force that she'd been held by, pressing her forehead against her mum's cheek so hard she could see spots of colour bloom on her vision. I love you more than anything. Her mum breathed in, the noise almost a snort, and Daisy could feel her body tense up. She let go, worried that she was hurting her. You're late for school, her mum said, the warmth stripped from her words. She was facing forward again, her arms by her side. You should go. But Mum, I don't want to leave. Go! The word shot from her mum's mouth like a bullet. Daisy crawled off the duvet, feeling like something was about to explode from her chest. She looked at the foot of the bed for a moment, looking at the dark lumps of shadow there. Then she retreated through the bedroom door. Her mum called out after her, her voice as flat as a recording. We'll see you soon. But somehow, Daisy knew that was a lie. Somehow, so deep down that she wasn't even aware of it, she understood that they would never see her again. Let's see if we can get through another 2. Yeah, we'll get through. We'll get to Cal's proper awakening with the Fury, which is the chapter after this one. Exciting. And one day I'll tell you where I got the idea for this book from, because it is actually hilarious. It's something that happened to me when I was at school, which wasn't hilarious at the time, but it is hilarious now looking back. I'll probably do that in a separate video. Brick, Fursville, 11:55 a.m. Brick sat on the wooden steps that led up to the log flume in Fursville, shaking so much that his elbows kept slipping off his knees. He'd ridden straight back to the park after the incident at the garage. They tried to kill me. They all wanted to kill me. Almost taking himself clean out by turning off the main road at 63 miles an hour, coming within a hair's width of decorating the smiley-faced "Welcome to Hemingway, please drive carefully" sign with his brains. The crowd had followed him down the road, their faces twisted and contorted in his single rear-view mirror, their eyes angry white blisters. They'd actually trampled each other, trying to get to him. The car that had almost knocked him off his bike had tried to come after him too, but it had veered off the road into a garden after a dozen yards or so. The driver kicking his way out of the broken windscreen and pursuing on foot. By the time they'd faded out of sight, there had been 20 people there. Men, women, kids, grandparents. Brick had seen all this with absolute clarity. Every bared tooth, every clenched jaw, every snatching, greedy finger. The kind of eagle-eyed, slow-motion action replay focus you only got when your life was hanging by a thread. He was paying the price for it now, though. His body felt like it had used up every last resource. Used up or wasted. He chucked his guts the moment he came through the hedge. Last night's popcorn, nothing but a milky foam. Now he felt the same way as he did when he was really ill, the light too bright, his body trembling, like it had once upon a time on the wacky walkway that was almost visible from where he was sitting. The worst of it was that somewhere en route he'd lost his phone and his wallet. They'd probably slipped from his pocket when he'd almost come off the bike, or maybe it had happened during the attack in the garage. The phone he didn't mind so much, but dropping his wallet could be bad. It meant the police would know he'd been in Hemingway. From there, it didn't take a genius to think of searching the old theme park. With any luck, it had fallen into a bush or down a rabbit hole, but luck wasn't the sort of thing that came willingly to Brick Thomas. His elbow slipped off his leg again, jolting his head. He replaced it, shivering, his chattering teeth like hail on a tin roof, the loudest thing in the park. He was shaking so much he felt like a pneumatic drill, like he was about to hammer himself into the ground, and he pushed himself to his feet, pacing. What the hell was going on? There was an explanation banging on the door of his head, yelling at him, but he was refusing to pay it any attention. He was refusing because it was stupid. Even though he'd seen stuff like this in a million movies, people turning feral, ripping into their loved ones. Usually it happened when the dead came back to life, but not always. Sometimes it was a virus or something, like in that film Lisa loved, 28 Days Later. Zombies, great thinking, Brick, you're a genius. But that was exactly it. Zombies were something from the telly, from video games. They didn't exist in real life. They couldn't exist. It was impossible. Then what was it? What had turned Lisa against him, and then invited the whole goddamned world to take a shot? Yeah, I mean, he had one of those faces, but it wasn't that bad. It wasn't Frankenstein's monster bad enough to rile the mob. As far as he could tell, there were 3 ways of finding out. First, he could call his dad, ask him what was going on, see if it was happening in the city too. Of course, that was no longer an option, because his mobile was gone, and the nearest payphone was, Brick, try not to laugh at the irony, back in the garage he'd just fled from. Second, he could clean the puke from his saddle, get back on his bike, and head somewhere else, back into Norwich maybe. This wasn't really an attractive option either, because if a garage full of people had almost killed him, then a whole city full would certainly succeed. It felt a bit like diving into a shark-infested ocean to see whether there was a great white hiding beneath your boat. That left door number 3, the basement door. His laptop was in there. It had been on the table when he and Lisa had cartwheeled over it, so he didn't even know if it was still okay, and the fact that she obviously hadn't used it to email anyone for help wasn't a great sign. But maybe she just hadn't thought of it, or maybe the dongle had come loose and she couldn't get it to work again. Either way, if he could get in and snatch his computer, then he'd be able to search the news sites, see what was going on. He had a store of food and drink in there too, not much, but enough to keep him going for a day or two. The thought of opening that door, of seeing what was inside, made him shudder harder, and he had to sit back down on the steps. The wooden frame of the flume creaked overhead, expanding in the fierce midday heat. The sun was behind the big wheel, painting the park in a cobweb of fine, dancing shadows, so fierce that Brick had to close his eyes to stop the itch of light on his retinas. For a wonderful, mesmerising instant when he opened them again, Fursville looked just like it had a decade ago. The haze shimmering from the cracked earth, giving the illusion of movement, of people. It was so strong that Brick could even hear the song of the arcade machines from the pier, remarkably loud as they travelled on the warm summer breeze. Then he remembered Lisa, throwing herself at the door so hard that he had heard the snap of wood or bone from the top of the stairs, even with his hands over his ears, even past his wretched sobs. The illusion vanished, leaving him alone. Brick stood again, his twitching body unable to stay still. If he was going to do this, he had to do it now. He set off towards the pavilion, both hands clenched in his tangled hair like he was a prisoner being marched at gunpoint. He reached the fire door, thinking, please God, don't let this be the last time I see the sun, as he squeezed under the chain. He didn't let himself stop, knowing that if he paused for so much as a second, he'd never get moving again. He'd end up like one of the plastic statues outside, the grinning squirrels in the crazy gulf, frozen until the end of time. He jogged to the door at the top of the basement staircase and peered down into that throat of darkness. The bottom corner of the lower door had been bent out from the wall, but it was still closed, the metal bar firmly in place. No light crept through it now. He couldn't hear anything. but it didn't stop him wanting to put his fingers in his ears and hum a tune at full volume as he stepped softly downwards. If he couldn't hear her, then maybe it would all be okay. He put his ear to the door, his breath locked tight, feeling like he was about to throw up again. Not food this time, but his heart, which was so far up in his throat he could taste each beat like copper on his tongue. It was silent in there, as if he had his ear against a coffin lid. "Lisa," he said, realising only after a moment or two that he hadn't spoken the word out loud. He struggled to unblock his windpipe. "Lisa!" He barked the word out this time, making himself jump. It sounded like it had been loud enough to bring the roof down. He held his breath again, listening. There was movement inside the basement, a noise like something heavy being dragged across the ground. A torso, Brick thought. It sounds like somebody moving a corpse. There was a quiet cry, a kitten's mewl, followed by silence. At least she was still alive. The knowledge filled Brick with equal amounts of relief and terror. Alive but weak, perhaps. He might be able to open the door, run in, grab what he needed and get out before she even really noticed he was there. He went to call her name again, then thought better of it. In his head he counted down. 3, 2, and without waiting for one, he kicked out at the bar, sending it clattering to the floor. He wrenched open the door, uttering a short, desperate cry of his own. Then, fists clenched so hard his nails were like scalpels in his palms, he stepped into the basement. Cal. Oakminster, 11:59 a.m. Cal crouched on the grass, the sun trying to peel open his head, the heat drumming on his skull, thump thump, thump thump, thump thump, wondering why the pain had gotten so bad in the space of a couple of hours. He really did feel like he was about to puke, not just the too much milkshake nausea he'd had last night, but something else. It was like he needed to purge something poisonous from his body, to vomit it up from every cell. He felt that if he could do that, then maybe the turbine that was roaring in his head would finally stop. The shrill call of the whistle made him wince, and he squinted up to see Mr. Lyons jogging onto the pitch. Both teams were waiting for the game to start, eyeballing each other over the halfway line. Cal had gone to the changing rooms as normal, wondering if anyone would mention what had happened yesterday on the plaza. Nobody had, but the way his mates wouldn't meet his eye, gazing at the floor as they walked outside, was evidence enough that they were ashamed or embarrassed. Cal reached down and grabbed the bottle of Dr. Pepper by his foot, finished it off and tossed it into the nearby sideline. Behind it was the pitcher's only stand, and it was packed, 200 kids waiting for the match to begin. The usual suspects were once again in the front row, Eddie sitting in between Megan and Georgia. For once, Georgia didn't have her book with her and was joining in with the chants. The noise was exhilarating. He looked at the clock. 12 o'clock. Chris did a few keepy-uppies before placing the ball on the centre spot. Lions blew for the game to start, and Cal charged into the opposition side of the pitch. It didn't take long for the ball to find him, a clever volley from Stephen. Cal controlled it, knocking it ahead and chasing, feeling like it was running at the speed of sound. He heard somebody yell, "Man on!" and stopped abruptly, trapping the ball as the defender flew past. Then he turned and scanned the pitch for white shirts, lobbing the ball in towards the box. It wasn't his best pass, granted, and one of the other team intercepted, heading it clear. Still, it was pretty obvious that it was going to be a good game. An easy game. The other team were pressing forward and Cal jogged after them, happy to let the defence handle it. Jack, the keeper, caught a shot and booted the ball upfield. The crowd was less noisy now, nothing more than a handful of chants and insults hurled onto the pitch. They were probably saving their breath for the goals. Cal glanced over as he ran, waving at Eddie and Megan and Georgia. They were looking right at him, but none of them returned the gesture. Actually, everyone in the stands seemed to be looking right at him. They were facing the sun, so their eyes were narrow slits in their faces, but even so he could feel their gaze crawling over his skin like fingers, the sensation making him cold despite the heat. He shivered, more pain detonating right behind his forehead. Of course they're looking at me, he thought as he turned away. Everybody loves Callum Morrissey. Up the other end of the pitch, Naz was closing in on the goal. Jack trying to make himself as big as possible to stop the shot. His two centre-backs, Sam and Sprout, should have been chasing, but they were just standing there, like they didn't quite know what to do with themselves. They were both staring at Cal. Thump, thump. Thump, thump. Thump, thump. Confusion was making the engine in his head rev even harder, battering against the soft flesh of his brain. "Go on," he yelled, "tackle him!" More of the players were turning to face him now. Naz had actually frozen outside the 6-yard box, even though it was just him and the keeper, even though nothing was stopping him from taking the shot. The kid's head was twisted around too far as he fixed his eyes on Cal. Even Mr. Lyons was looking his way, his whistle clamped between his teeth. It was quiet enough in the stands now for Cal to be able to hear the whistle warble softly every time the teacher exhaled. Jack took a couple of steps towards the ball, then stumbled to a halt, as if his batteries had just run out. He raised his head, his eyes dark despite the sunlight on his face. Jack was the last. Now every single person was looking at Cal. The only sound was the soft whisper of the whistle, almost lost behind the hammer blows inside his head. "What?" he asked, his voice ridiculously loud against the unnatural canvas of silence. He turned to the crowd. People were standing, pushing themselves out of their seats. The way they moved reminded Cal of a flock of birds, how they all seemed to do the same thing at the same time without being told. 200 or so people swayed as one. Their gaze, so intense, it seemed to push Cal down into the warm soil. It's a reality TV show, he thought, as he scanned the pitch, the players like statues. No, like gargoyles. Their lips pulled back, their teeth clenched, their eyes bulging, so full of anger and madness. "I'm being filmed right now. This is all a setup, Jackass or something like that. Just be cool, Cal. You don't want to look like a loser." And it had to be that, didn't it? How could it be anything else? But something in his head, something buried deeper than the ache, was screaming at him. It was just about the oldest, simplest, most instinctive message the body was capable of sending. Run. And Cal would have too if the pulse of agony in his head hadn't vanished. Thump, 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 thump. Gone. So suddenly that it was as if somebody had thrown a switch. He'd had the headache for so long that for a second or two its absence was almost worse, like not having it meant that there was something missing in his brain. But there was no denying the relief. "Oh, it's gone," he said, wondering if, when they watched the episode of whatever prank show this was, that they'd be able to spot the exact moment when the razor wire was pulled from his brain. "Hey guys, it's..." His words dried up as Mr. Lyons started running towards him. Not jogging, sprinting. His face knuckled into a fist of rage. Others followed, as if the teacher pulled them behind him. A peal of thunder rose up from the other direction, and Cal swung round to see the crowd surging from the stands. A tidal wave that crashed and spat down the aisles, spilling over the seats. There was so much movement that the ground was shaking. He managed one more empty smile. It lasted no more than a second, enough time for Cal to realise that there were no cameras, that there had been no cue for everyone to start running, enough time for him to hear that voice inside him, that raging, desperate animal cry which screamed, "Run, run, run." Enough time for him to understand with absolute clarity that if he didn't obey that voice, then he was going to die. He lurched so hard that he almost tripped on his own feet, bolting up the middle of the pitch as the crowd surged onto it. He saw a couple of kids from the front row fall beneath the weight of them, a wet, red explosion erupting briefly, then lost in the surging mass of feet. He ran faster than he thought possible, the adrenaline in his veins like nitrous oxide in a car, a shot of pure fuel, his arms and legs pistoning him across the school field. Cal risked to look over his shoulder to see Naz right behind him, spit hanging from his too wide mouth, his eyes hate-filled sores in his face as he gained ground. Behind him churned the crowd, a tsunami of flesh. Cal put his head down, trying to speed up even though his lungs were already burning. He was fast, but he couldn't manage an all-out sprint for long. The main school building was in sight. If he could just get inside, then somebody would stop this, one of the teachers or the headmaster. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he saw a group of kids sitting outside the doors lift their heads, sniffing the air like lions scenting a gazelle. As one, they scrambled to their feet, charging towards him, that same look of lunatic rage turning their faces into crude Halloween masks. Cal angled off to the left, towards the bike sheds, his mind a hissing mess of white noise. There were more kids converging on him from the school doors. One of them screamed, a brittle shriek that was picked up by somebody in the crowd behind him, and Cal only realised how quiet they'd all been when they all started to cry out, the sound of it deafening, almost a physical force against his ears. It was all he could do not to collapse right there, clamp his hands over his head and just pray that it would be quick. He heard rasping, jagged breaths right behind him. Then something brushed his shoulder. Cal forced himself to think. He'd been studying martial arts for years now, but every single thing he'd learned had somehow been sucked from his brain, dissolved by terror. Naz reached again, and this time he snagged Cal's shirt, yanking him so hard that he missed his footing. Cal fell, skidding on his knees, almost managing to push himself back up again before Naz thumped into him, sending them both sprawling. Naz pinned him and threw a punch that glanced off Cal's jaw, not hard enough to hurt. He could hear the relentless pounding of feet, those banshee screams rising to a hideous crescendo. "Think!" screamed his brain, his body unable to draw breath. Flashing spots appeared in his vision, leaving charred black scars when they faded. "Do something or they're going to kill you!" He bent and spread his legs beneath Naz's weight, planting his feet firmly on the ground. Then he punched up with both arms, knocking Naz's hands loose and trapping them beneath his own. At the same time he rolled his hip, pushing up with a grunt. Naz tumbled off, the murder never leaving his eyes. Cal lashed out, hitting him square in the throat as he jumped up. Someone else was right there, reaching for him, and Cal shoved the kid as hard as he could. He ducked under another pair of hands, plunged into shade as the crowd tried to surround him. It was like running into a forest of limbs. Root-like feet tripped him, torsos like trunks blocked his way. Cal threw himself at the only shard of sunlight that remained. Breaking free, his body numb as he started to run again. He was right next to the school building now. One of the windows exploded outwards, a bloodied face squirming through teeth of broken glass. Cal scrambled past the bike sheds and up the narrow path along the side of the school. Straight ahead were the gates, and past them Rochester Street, with its cars and its crowds. There was nothing but death that way. To his side was a fence, and past that a strip of woodland. The trees there were spindly, too few to provide any cover. But what choice did he have? He leapt the fence, grateful that there was no barbed wire as he flopped clumsily over the top. Through the mesh he could see the crowd flood the passageway, a thrashing river that pushed itself against the wire, causing the posts to bend into the woodland. Megan was there, or something demonic that had once been Megan, her hands twisted into talons, straining for him. Cal gulped down air, slipping and tripping over the rough ground. Somehow he ran, using the trees to push himself on until he hit the fence that backed onto Rochester Street. He climbed, slipped, climbed again, rolling head first over it. Hands reached through the wire, pinching his shirt, his flesh, driving him to his feet again. He heard an engine gun, looking up in time to see a car veer across the street, straight at him. Through the sunlight-dazzled windscreen, he could make out a face identical to the ones behind him, and it was the sight of this warped mask, rather than 2 solid tons of silver SUV, that made him dive to the side. The car slammed into the fence, piling right through it into the crowd. Cal knew this because of the sounds, a song of muffled snaps. He looked back to see that people were pulling themselves over a mound of ruined bodies, twitching limbs, their eyes still blazing. One girl was crawling after him, even though her left arm was no longer properly attached. She pulled it behind her like a baby dragging a toy. Cal scanned the street as he limped onwards, his brain running in double time, his body filled with lead. People were streaming from the Tesco supermarket opposite the school. More cars were accelerating up the hill, veering wildly from side to side. One smashed into a lamppost, bending it at a 45-degree angle. The driver, a middle-aged man, had opened the door and was stumble running across the road, shrieking. The car. It was his only chance. Cal threw himself towards the man, waiting until he was close enough before unleashing a powerful kick. His football studs sank into the man's face, almost making him do a full backwards flip. Cal raced for the car, throwing himself into the driver's seat and closing the door just as the first of the Tesco shoppers reached him. The engine had stalled. Cal pushed in the clutch and twisted the key the way he'd been taught to in his driving lessons, and the engine roared to life. A woman was swinging her basket at the window, the glass already cracking. More shapes threw themselves at the doors, and Cal engaged the central locking just in time. Somebody had climbed onto the bonnet and was kicking at the windscreen. Cal tried to wrestle the gear stick into reverse. It wouldn't go. He felt it with both hands, finding a ring on the shift, pulling it up and allowing the stick to slot into place. He revved and let the clutch rise. The engine stuttered, then cut out. The passenger window exploded, hands reaching in. There was no sunlight left inside the car. 3 more people now on the bonnet, so many on the roof that it was bowing inwards, the metal creaking. He turned the key again, forgetting to push in the clutch. The car juddered, people falling from it into the crowd. Cal swore, pushing in the clutch, trying the ignition again, revving it hard with his right foot. The whole car was rocking now as the people outside attempted to roll it over. He let the clutch rise slowly. It bit, groaned, then the car jolted backwards. It didn't get far, the sea of bodies behind it blocking the way. Cal stomped on the accelerator, shunting his way through them. The car growled, flattening anything behind it as it gained speed. He slammed on the brakes, remembering to push in the clutch as well. He wrestled it into first, spinning the wheel all the way round as he pulled away, not caring that people were bouncing off the bumper, not caring that he drove right into a kid that he'd played football with against yesterday, not caring that the car was bucking wildly because of the countless squirming bodies beneath the wheels. He just drove down the hill as fast as he could, screaming silently through the sun-drenched, ruby-red stained glass of his windscreen. My goodness, it's not going very well for any of our characters, but then it wouldn't be a horror book, would it, if it was? We'll leave it there today. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you enjoyed it a little bit more than Cal and Brick and Daisy have. I mean, things are pretty miserable for them, and it's really only just started. So, I don't know what you're up to today. I hope it's something nice. Just remember that even when it's raining, there are people out there who love you. And yeah, even if you're having a bad day, things will get better. And I hope that you find some time today to just be kind to yourself and do something nice for yourself, even if that's just a little thing like making a cup of tea. But anyway, look after yourselves. And yeah, I will see you probably tomorrow. Mwah. Love you guys. See you soon.